All right, welcome everybody. Jamil Jivani here, the president of the Canada Strong and Free Network, and I'm very happy to welcome you to the first installment of what's going to be a monthly series of virtual discussions called the Canadian Optimists. And we're going to talk a bit about why the Canadian Optimists, both with my co-hosts Matt and Chris Spoke, and also with our special guest today, Ontario's Labour Minister, Monty McNaughton. Before I get to our guests, though, I do want to start off with some announcements about what the Canada Strong and Free Network has been up to since many of you last joined us for a virtual event or perhaps attended our annual national networking conference in Ottawa back in May. We have two things going on that we're busy at work organizing over the summer that I'm excited to share with you. The first is our next networking conference, which we just announced a couple of days ago. It is going to be on September 24th in Red Deer, Alberta. And it's going to be a really exciting time for Conservatives to get together. We'll be 2 weeks removed from the next federal leader of the Conservative Party being elected. So there will be a lot of stuff for us to talk about in terms of the future of the movement. We're going to have some fantastic guests joining us at that conference on September 24th, details of which we will be sharing on our listserv and social media over the course of the next few weeks. I will say one of the highlights of the day will be the participation of the Alberta United Conservative Party leadership candidates, almost all of whom have given us a confirmation that they will be there on the 24th. So there'll be some really exciting conversations, some great stuff for you to participate in, an opportunity to meet some of the leadership candidates, and also discuss the state of the national movement coming out of the next federal leadership election. So a lot of exciting stuff will be on the docket. And as I said, we'll be sending updates about content and guests over the next few weeks. But I do hope you will join us. Again, that's on September 24th in Red Deer. Those who attend our conference in September will also get a special discount on next year's annual national conference in Ottawa, which has been scheduled for April 26th to the 28th. And details about that will be shared in the coming weeks and months as well. So a lot of exciting stuff on the conference end. We're also happy to announce that we are organizing our first ever mentorship program, which is called Conservative Values Tomorrow. And we are currently accepting applications from Canadians under the age of 30 to participate in that program. We'll be putting together our first cohort for Conservative Values Tomorrow. And these young conservatives will receive mentorship and skills development opportunities, as well as the ability to participate in our conference in September, as well as our conference next spring. You can see in the chat box there that Zoe is sharing links both to register for the September conference and also the website conservativetomorrow.ca, which is where Canadians under 30 can apply to be part of the program. The deadline is August 5th. So if you are in that age range, we highly encourage you to check out the website and submit an application. If you know somebody who is in that age range, please do share it with them. We really do believe that part of our calling right now at this point in our country's history is to engage millennials and Gen Zers in the conservative movement. And we can do that with your help. So please do feel free to share that website, conservativetomorrow.ca, as you see fit. I really believe this program is going to be a fantastic step in the right direction, not just for our organization, not just for the conservative movement, but for Canada as a whole. So with those announcements off the top, again, I'm really happy to welcome you to the first installment of the Canadian Optimists series. I am joined by two of my co-hosts who you will come to know as we go through this series every month. They are both entrepreneurs who are also part of my generation, the millennial generation that we're talking about with the Conservative Values Tomorrow program. Matt and Chris Spoke are brothers who bring a lot of experience both in the business world, in the entrepreneurship world, and also in the tech space to these conversations. And I think that's a really key part of why we're excited about this idea of Canadian optimism, because their careers, their journeys as young leaders in this country really do speak to why we have good reason to be optimistic about the future of Canada. And instead of me going on to introduce them, I think it'll be better if they have the chance to introduce themselves. So I will welcome both Chris Spoke and Matt Spoke, our co-hosts for the Canadian Optimist series.
Yeah, thanks, Jamil. So yes, as Jamil mentioned, my name is Chris Spoke. I operate a digital product studio here in Toronto. So we design and build mobile apps and that sort of thing. I also do some real estate investing, but I think kind of more relevant to this discussion is I do have an interest in Canadian conservative politics. My particular area of interest is housing. So I do speak and write about housing quite a bit, mostly for the Hub. I think a lot of you in the audience will be familiar with that publication. I'll let Matt introduce himself, and then maybe we'll tell you a little bit more of the series before we get into questions with Minister McNaughton.
Yeah, thanks, Chris, and good to be here. Thanks for the introduction, Jamil. My name is Matt Spoke, also based in Toronto. Super excited to be here. We started an earlier version of this during the pandemic, got excited about the idea of connecting with people virtually when we couldn't get together in person. And I think it's great that we're able to continue to do these on some frequency that is probably impractical to do in person. So to be able to come together once a month and talk about ideas. And I think that's what really attracts me to this. I mean, I'm an entrepreneur. I run a tech company here in Toronto in the financial services space. I've been doing this for about 6 or 7 years. And frankly, everybody that I work with always asks me why I bother to spend time in political conversations and political discourse, because it's generally two completely different worlds. But what excites me about the world of entrepreneurship is a mentality of ambition and optimism and sort of vision for the future. And I think the more we can take that and translate that into the way that we talk about political ideas and topics, and start to talk tactically about how we translate that into action, particularly within the conservative movement, I think there's a lot of reason to be optimistic about the future of Canada. And we want to uncover some of those reasons in this series. So we'll chat a little bit more. I'll pass it back to Chris to give you a sense of why we named the series The Canadian Optimists and what we'd like to uncover both today with Minister McNaughton as well as over the course of the next several months.
Yeah, I hope, by the way, I hope we don't speak too quickly. That's like feedback we've gotten in the past. So if you want to throw in the chat, like go 80% as fast, we'll do our best. This is like, we try to recreate the 1.5x speed experience. Okay, so Canadian Optimist, which is the name, of course, of this monthly series. Our inspiration for the name came from two places. So the first, and maybe most obvious, some of you in the audience might be familiar with a podcast called The American Optimist. So this podcast was created and is hosted by Joe Lonsdale, who is one of the PayPal co-founders. He's a tech founder beyond that. He's invested and founded, I think, 3 or 4 companies since then. And he brings kind of like a unique perspective from Silicon Valley, which is that, again, he's a tech entrepreneur, but he's also a conservative. And like, you don't often see that combination coming out of Silicon Valley. So American Optimist, we thought we'd try to take some of that energy and recreate it for Canada. Stephen Harper actually was a guest on his podcast, and I highly recommend that you guys all check it out. It's just a great series. The second source of inspiration, I think, was a book called 0 to 1, which was written by Peter Thiel. So again, the PayPal founder, first outside investor in Facebook, probably someone that you're all familiar with. In his book 0 to 1, he kind of creates this dichotomy between an optimistic perspective and a pessimistic perspective as it comes to thinking about the future. So he defines a definite optimist, specifically a definite optimist, as someone who thinks the future will be better than the present if he or she plans and works to make it better. So this was largely the ethos that helped build and grow our country. People were both optimistic about the future, but they also understood that the future was not something that you could observe unfolding. It wouldn't just unravel according to its own designs. It was something that you had to actively and purposefully build. There's this phrase that was popularized by social scientist Francis Fukuyama that we've reached the end point of history, the end of history. So this is kind of like contrary to that. Like, history is not over. History continues to unfold, and it's up to us as individuals, as a community, as cities, provinces, and a country to build that future, to shape it into what we want to see. I think it's a very kind of like high agency view of the future, that we actually have to get involved and not just let it play out again according to its own designs. So we'd like to use this series to identify and interview Canadian optimists, whether inside or outside of government, starting, of course, with Minister McNaughton, to both promote their optimism, which we think is important, and I think lacking. There's a bit of a deficit, I think, of optimism when we spend too much of our time reading the news. But not just to promote their optimism, but to also inspire others to adopt it for themselves. So we hope that this is ultimately something that people leave with inspiration and with like some more motivation maybe for getting more involved, whether politically or in their community or whatever it may be, to take that optimism and turn it into like not just a noun but a verb, something that you do, right? So welcome to Canadian Optimists. I think with that, Matt, I don't know if you want to say a little bit more. If not, Jamil will kick off our first question.
Yeah, I mean, there maybe one just sort of anecdote to tie onto that, because I think it's very telling of where we are in Canada and probably more broadly in the Western world. But I remember very vividly a couple of months ago sitting down and having a conversation with one of Canada's most successful entrepreneurs, I would say, and talking about this idea. I mean, this idea of like, why aren't you more involved in the Canadian political discourse? Why do we not see more people that have built things getting active? And what shocked me most was not that he shared my enthusiasm, but that he sort of told me, don't waste your time. You know, this is a domain and an arena that generally is overwhelmed with short-term discourse, with pessimism, with reasons to sort of think more about the flaws in our country than the opportunities. And I think that's where we see the opportunity to maybe inject a new perspective. And we intend to do that through a couple of ways. I mean, one, hopefully we'll bring our own energy between the three of us co-hosting this series, but two, to also bring people that are optimistic in their roles, optimistic in their fields. I mean, both, you know, to Chris's point, within and outside of government, I think it's important that we match thinkers that are not necessarily in elected office, you know, the economists and the big thinkers of the world that have ideas maybe inside and outside of Canada, but then also translate those into strategies and actions and insights as to how can we more proactively shape what the next decades look like? How can we take a political environment that generally thinks sort of election cycle to election cycle and turn that into a vision that really translates into what do we want our country to look like over the coming decades and century? I think it requires that we start anchoring ourselves in long-term vision. And you know, we'll do our best to try to match both like what can we do now and what are our political elected leaders doing now, but also how can we anchor that into some sort of more ambitious outcome that we all aspire to. So with that, I'll pass it back to Jamil to kick us off. And we're super excited, both just the timing of having Minister McNaughton with us, but also just the tone I think this conversation will set up for the rest of the series. So back to you, Jamil.
Well, thanks. So I think everybody can get a sense of what we mean by Canadian optimism from Matt and Chris. And I honestly couldn't think of a better politician in the country right now to help us kick this off. Many of you might know that I had the opportunity to be an advisor to the government of Ontario over the last couple of years. And Minister McNaughton, I would say with great certainty, is one of the brightest thinking politicians in the country. I had the privilege of working with him and coming to befriend him. And I just really think that he's got a great story and some great insights to share with us. So let me introduce him before we start asking him some questions, hopefully some tough ones too. So Minister McNaughton is of course the minister that oversees labor and immigration policy files, as well as skills development for the government of Ontario right now. And he draws on his background where his family owned a home hardware store in Newbury, Ontario. He was first appointed the Minister of Labor back in June 2019, and before that was Minister of Infrastructure. As Minister of Labor, one of his signature items was the building opportunities in the Skilled Trades Act, which modernized the skilled trade system. He has been a member of the Ontario Provincial Parliament since 2011, representing the riding of Lambton, Kent, Middlesex. He's a graduate of Westervelt Business College in London. He later completed an executive program at the Richard Ivey School of Business in Western University. He and his wife, Kate, currently live in Mount Bridges, Ontario, with their daughter, Annie. And as he and many others in the Ford administration are riding high right now, coming out of a big landslide majority win last month. So we're very grateful to have him. Minister McNaughton, I think to get us started, I'd love to, if you could just share with our audience a bit about your first mandate before we start looking ahead to what you have planned moving forward with the new mandate. Maybe you could just speak to the theme of working for workers that you developed over the course of your first few years as Minister of Labor.
Great. Well, first off, I want to say hi to everyone and thank you for joining us today. Jamil, thank you, Matt, Chris, and Canada Strong and Free for the invitation. I'm really excited about what you're setting out to do, what your mission is to engage conservatives from across Canada. I think it's so important. I mean, I believe fundamentally we are the movement of optimism, and we should never cede that to other parties, whether it's any other party provincially or across Canada. Look, this all started for me and for Premier Ford and our government, this Working for Workers mission back in June of 2019. So after our first year in government, we had a pretty major cabinet shuffle, as many will remember, and the Premier asked me to become the Minister of Labor. And so that was June of 2019. And I remember for the 3 or 4 months following, I mean, I just set out to meet with as many blue collar union leaders as possible. I mean, I think we met with 100 labor leaders in the private sector right across the province in the first 90 days or 100 days. I became the first Minister of Labor to march in the Labor Day parade in Toronto to stand with those blue collar women and men who are building Ontario. And then from that point on, we continued to reach out to workers, to employers, to more labor leaders, and really just to hear what needed to be done. We introduced, as you mentioned, Jamil, the Building Opportunities in the Skilled Trades Act to begin the process of ending the stigma around the skilled trades, to start telling people in Ontario that you don't have to go to university to be successful. There are other pathways in life to earn 6 figures and have a defined pension and benefits, and jobs where you can build a family around and strengthen our communities. And those are careers in the skilled trades. And then past that, we began to get ideas to really introduce major changes in legislation to work for workers across the province. And this was a different path for a Conservative government. I mean, look, I've been pretty clear. I think Conservative governments and Conservative politicians in the past have failed by not reaching out to blue collar workers and to blue collar unions, because we share a lot of the same values. I mean, the value of good, well-paying jobs to build families around, defined pensions and benefits, like those are good things. As Conservatives, we value, health and safety and people coming home safely to their families at the end of a hard day's work. And we also value spreading opportunity more widely and fairly. So we had many discussions, I mean, literally hundreds, if not thousands of them, and we began building Working for Workers legislation. So last fall, we introduced Working for Workers 1, which really focus on allowing workers to have more time with the families by creating Canada's first right to disconnect policy. So any employer in Ontario with 25 or more employees has to tell their workers and be very transparent when they expect workers to respond to emails, take phone calls, just to really bring this issue front and center. And of course, the pandemic changed everything for workers and employers across the entire world, but we were focusing on Ontario. Secondly, in the Working for Workers Part 1, we became the first province in Canada to begin recognizing international credentials. And we've all talked about this for decades, but no government actually took this on. So for every regulated profession, whether it's skilled trades, engineering, architecture, law, teaching, I mean, dozens of professions, we eliminated the Canadian work experience. We eliminated the number of language tests that have to be done for newcomers. And for me, this really came about primarily from 2 reasons. Number one, in Ontario, only 25% of newcomers are actually working in fields that they've studied in the past. So, we all know stories of, engineers driving taxis. Like, my mission is to lift people up, and we want people earning more money, living, purpose-driven careers to provide more for their families and just to live better lives. So that's why we, move quickly to recognize international credentials. And then secondly, we have a massive labor shortage, which I'm sure we'll talk about later. Third, in the Working for Workers Act, we basically delivered dignity, human dignity for truck drivers and for delivery drivers. We put in law that they would have access to a washroom facility when they're delivering products to businesses. I mean, this is an issue that came out of the pandemic when truck drivers were going to warehouses and factories and they didn't have access to washroom facilities. So we did that. And lastly, we brought in the first foundational set of rights for gig workers in the province and in Canada. And there's going to be a lot of work on that to come and more to come. So those are some of the things we've done. But again, it's all about meaningful jobs, purpose-driven careers, and just building better lives for individuals and their families.
Yeah, thank you. I think another thing that I'll throw in that I've noticed you and your office have worked on is kind of like the elimination of non-competes. So the idea that an employer could bake into your contract a non-compete clause that requires that if you were to end your employment, you can no longer work in that field for some amount of time. And from my perspective, again, both Matt and I work in tech. This is one of these like high leverage changes, right? It's a small change on its face, but there's a disproportionate outcome. And I think like one of the reasons why California has been such a magnet for tech entrepreneurship and talent has been that non-competes are not enforceable in California. So that's another one I wanted to throw as like a feather in your cap and that of your office that I think was just a brilliant move and largely overdue. Next question I have is there's this idea in conservative politics. We've heard the term the Great Realignment, right? Which is that traditionally conservatives maybe have not performed as well with working class voters as they seem to be doing more recently. So one kind of very important data point is that the PC party in Ontario received, I believe, endorsements from 8 construction trade unions and some of the largest ones. So if you could, I'd love to hear your thoughts both on this idea of a great realignment, that working class people are seeing more of their priorities reflected in conservative politics and in conservative governments, and what you think is responsible for us being able, or I should say you being able to capitalize on that and really kind of make the PC party an attractive home for these voters.
Yeah, certainly. Look, conservatives are the parties of working class Canadians, and I think our success demonstrated that in Ontario. I mean, I go back again to the first few months of when I became the minister. I mean, just that relentless work of building relationships and reaching out to people that conservatives unfortunately haven't talked to in many years. But I've also been clear that the parties on the left have totally abandoned this work, these workers. I mean, they're more concerned about, statues and street names than they are now about jobs with defined pensions and benefits. And I mean, in Ontario, we have hundreds of thousands of skilled trades workers that belong to unions. I was down in Sarnia a few weeks ago. One of Canada's largest private sector construction projects is the Nova Chemical project. Construction, $3 billion. And the day I was down on that site, 1,800 women and men were working. There wasn't one of them earning less than $100,000 per year. Every one of them has a pension and benefits. And, we all know these men and women. They're our neighbors, they're our family members, they're our friends. They're investing in the economy. They're buying things. They're, registering their kids for sports or donating to their local churches and just building stronger communities. So this is something where I think conservative values align with these blue collar unions. I mean, I mentioned it before, but well-paying jobs with pensions and benefits, health and safety. But this idea of spreading opportunity more widely and fairly. And I just want to tell you a really, I think, optimistic and inspirational story. A couple of years ago, I met a young lady, Natisha. She grew up, I remember her telling me, in community housing in Toronto. She was a single mom, 2 young daughters, and she was on social assistance. She had an opportunity to participate in a pre-apprenticeship program that the building trades unions run in Toronto to attract, people like her and others from underrepresented groups and disadvantaged communities into these programs. So for 16 weeks, she tried the different skilled trades. She started a formal apprenticeship program. And about a year ago, she became a licensed iron worker. And I remember getting her phone number and calling her to congratulate her. And I said, Natisha, like, what is the best thing now about being an iron worker and being in the trades? And she said, well, I'm making $44.08 an hour. She goes, for the first time in my life, my daughters look up to me and I can buy a car for the first time. I mean, it's those stories that, one, conservatives need to tell, but like, these are things that the left parties in Ontario, like, they're not focusing on these types of issues and these programs to literally lift people up. And again, this is about meaningful jobs, purpose-driven careers, and I think it's inspirational, and it's the Conservative Party that's delivering for these workers.
Yeah, and just to add to that briefly, I think that tying it into the name of our series and this theme, construction is like one of the most optimistic things you can do, right? Because by definition, you're planning for something to exist that does not currently exist. And if we have this dichotomy where conservatives are the party of construction and building, and other parties are the parties of like tearing down statues and revisiting past injustices, it just makes the contrast so stark. And I'm very happy to find ourselves on the future oriented kind of optimistic side of things. So I think that's great.
Yeah, Chris, not to interrupt, but you're exactly right. I mean, the other parties are battling, old battles, and we're forward looking, and that's where our movement needs to be focused on. It's building a stronger Canada for families and for individuals.
I'll jump in here. Thanks for that, Minister. I'm sort of curious, maybe to take you out a little bit from your particular file and portfolio, and just to sort of zoom out on the broader idea of like setting long-term visions for both our province and our country. I mean, I think one of the things that seems like, if I could find a criticism of our Canadian political system, it probably won't take me too long to find one, is that a lot of our discourse ends up rotating around sort of the 4-year or 5-year or 2-year election cycles and what's going to get us into office. And often I find, probably not unique to conservatives, but you hear a lot about what do we need to do to win. You hear less about what are we going to do after we win, I'm sort of curious on your take when you think about our, what we're trying to talk about here, Canadian optimism. I love the narrative of giving people purpose in their lives, giving people a path towards, planning for their families and having sort of more sustainable careers. I think if you can't come to Canada and have that type of aspiration, then we've missed the point. But maybe as a country, and within that, as the largest province in the country, how do we start setting visions for the future? How do we start creating a rallying cry around our citizens that says, this is what we want to build, this is what we want to look like in 30 years and 50 years, and tying all of the decisions that we make towards some sort of aspiration. And I think you hear a little bit about that, but it doesn't really feed well into what does it take to get reelected in 4 years. But I'd be curious if you take your hat off as a minister and start and give us your perspective on that.
Yeah, a couple of things. I mean, great question, Matt. Again, I go back to our recent campaign. Premier Ford's agenda and what we took to the voters was all about building the future of Ontario. So whether it's the largest subway expansion in our history, whether it's building highways, roads, bridges, whether it's connecting every single household in Ontario to broadband by 2025, or attracting all kinds of investment. I think we're up to $16 billion in investment now from the automotive sector. I mean, just before the election, we announced that new electric vehicle plant down in Windsor, 2,500 well-paying jobs. Again, every job will come with a pension and benefits, which is great for workers, but also great for communities across Ontario. So as conservatives, I agree with you. We need to talk about long-term projects, the long-term of our provinces or country. And this idea of building, I think, is really one that we can all rally behind. Secondly, just to talk a bit about, I think something that's going to be long-term, but certainly overdue, something that I'm going to take on in this mandate. One thing that really shocked me when I first became the Minister of Labor Training and Skills Development in the first term was that under the Liberal government here in Ontario, we didn't have our training programs open to people on social assistance. So in the last 15 years prior to us winning government in 2018, only 1% of people on social assistance here in Ontario ever left. So about 6 months ago, we opened up training programs to people on social assistance. So whether it was Ontario Works or disability, to start again getting them into meaningful jobs. And the program, it's called Better Jobs Ontario. We're doing things now like buying work boots for people to, start a job in construction or start a pre-apprenticeship program. We're buying uniforms. I remember meeting a gentleman who was on disability. He's now working 40 hours a week at a retail store. Major shortages there, but he's really happy living with purpose. We're buying transit passes now to help people on social assistance, get to and from work. So we're really reforming the system with a focus on these 864,000 people in Ontario that have been stuck being dependent on government, in some cases, unfortunately, for generations. But I see that as something really positive, and again, lifting people up. And I'm excited. We're going to be able to work on this over the next 4 years, but this is something that needs to continue for years to come.
Yeah, I think that resonates a lot with me. I mean, if I were to maybe summarize how I think about the two ends of our political spectrum today, it feels like on the one hand, we can build a government on which people depend, or on the other hand, we can build a society in which people need to depend less on their government. And the more we can sort of transition to that latter bucket, I think we're going to have a lot more to be optimistic about in the future.
Yeah, I think what a lot of people have enjoyed about your tenure as the Minister of Labor and what you've done with your office is you've done a lot of obviously good things that are kind of like, why didn't we do this, a long time ago? So you mentioned recognizing foreign credentials. So we have a very, very kind of, we're an attractive country to immigrants. People want to move here to participate in the Canadian dream and economic opportunity. And then we don't recognize their credentials, even if they're coming from institutions and countries that have similar standards of quality and whatever. So I think that's like one example of you and your office doing something that is so obvious that it's almost mind-blowing that it hadn't been done before. Another one from this government, if not from your file specifically, with the Ontario line in Toronto. So this is a new subway line. We're now going to build towers on top of subway stations, which again is like the most obvious thing in the world. Until you look at the last subway line that we built, which is the Eglinton Crosstown, where we didn't do any of that. So we didn't get like a proper return on that investment. We're not maximizing the use of the infrastructure. So I think a lot of people who aren't in government and have not been in government, we often wonder why does it take so long for obvious things to get done? So there's often this consensus among, let's say, the constituency, even conservative voting base. There's a consensus among elected politicians and political staff. And yet there's often this disconnect where we're not seeing the legislative action. So the two examples I brought up are obviously ones where we did see the action, but there's this long list of things where it's like, what's going on? Why are we not doing this yet? So what can you tell us about the machinery of government, I guess, like how the sausage is made and where like the roadblocks are?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, I will say I want to give a lot of credit to my team who have done tremendous work. One of the things, when we go back to even our infrastructure days, I mean, I always had an open door policy. I want people coming forward with ideas, and it's about selecting those good ideas. And, again, I would argue day and night that everything we're doing is really conservative. I mean, better jobs and bigger paychecks, those are conservative values, and it's helping us from an economic perspective. I'm fortunate. Premier Ford, he really stands up for the little guy. I mean, I remember his brother Rob. He was the same, and Doug does get things done. Like that was our slogan during the election. And you referenced the Ontario line and how we're building this infrastructure and building, that residential, those towers there. Like that's because of the Premier's leadership. And we continue to push the bureaucracy. And I will say, I mean, I give credit to my ministry team as well. On the bureaucratic side, they've worked really, really closely to move forward with a really aggressive labor agenda, and working together, we've gotten that done. I will say as well, I didn't mention this in the beginning, but these common sense things that we all wonder why they weren't done earlier. In our second Working for Workers Act, one of the items in there was to improve labor mobility within Canada. So for skilled trades workers, in some cases, it was taking 12 months to actually come to Ontario to begin working. So whether it was a nuclear plant, the Nova chemical project down in Sarnia I was talking about, transit projects, it could take a long, long time. We introduced a law that essentially ensures that we have a 30-day guarantee for credentials to be recognized. But as conservatives, we know that sometimes it's harder to do trade or have labor mobility within our own borders than it is in other countries. But that's another thing that came forward, that we're knocking down those barriers as well.
This is a perfect setup for my next question, because I think you sort of hinted at it. I mean, the bureaucracy in the public service is a big part of, call it the execution arm of government, right? So, and how much government policy actually gets implemented really comes down to the efficacy of our public service in a lot of cases, right? I think the big criticism we've seen of our federal government today is that you hear a lot about the fanfare of announcements, but you don't hear a lot on the follow through and the execution of something that's intended to get done that never does get done, or gets done poorly. I'm curious, I mean, from my perspective, not being in government, it does seem like there's a general disadvantage to conservatives, because if I were to guess, the public service would probably lean in a different direction politically. So, it feels like there's a natural tension or friction that exists there. But also just like the broader question of like state capacity and sort of government competence in execution. This to me feels like one of the most important issues of our time is not necessarily do we have really exciting ideas, but can we implement them, right? So, I'll take your last example, implementing a law that says we have a 30-day guarantee on credentials coming in from other provinces. How does that translate into a public service that actually can meet that guarantee, and processes and sort of best practices? And what do we need to know that we don't know about, like how the public service works and the incentives and the disincentives? Because it feels like if we just push big ideas at a public service that can't get them done, then we end up not really moving the needle in a meaningful way.
Yeah, I mean, I can't speak to, across all the different ministries in Ontario, but just looking at our ministry, which started out at labor, then training was added, which was a skilled trades component, and then skills development, and now immigration. On the immigration side, which I think is in sharp contrast to the federal Liberals, we select about 9,700 immigrants in Ontario out of 212,000 that's coming this year through the federal government, which is another beef that we have, because we want more of a say in economic immigrants to bring in skilled newcomers to fill labor shortages. But we're approving provincially application forms from newcomers on average within 90 days. Contrast that to the federal government. I mean, in some of the immigration programs, it's 42 months. How are we ever going to fill labor shortages if it takes almost 4 years to attract skilled newcomers and bring them here? So, I'm pretty confident in our ministry and getting things done. But again, we push and we work constructively together. Another point, because it speaks to doing things differently around the skilled trades, we inherited a system called the Ontario College of Trades, which was set up under the McGuinty Liberals and continued with the Wynne government. But it was really complex. It was taking months and months for an individual to sign up and register as an apprentice in Ontario. So we wound that down, abolished it, and we created something called Skilled Trades Ontario. And essentially, it's a small government, nimble body that's going to oversee all of the apprenticeships in Ontario. So they're going to work with, colleges on training, the unions who do tremendous work on the training front here in Ontario, the work with employers, but most importantly, with that individual, that man or woman who wants to register to be an apprentice. And we launched that on January the 1st of this year. And it'll be a one-stop shop for the skilled trades, and they're registering apprentices now, in some cases within 48 hours. So, it can be done. The minister has to push, the staff have to push, and there really has to be an alignment on the ministry side. I count my blessings. We've been able to work together, and proud of the entire team.
I think those types of case studies are the types that we should be highlighting and putting a spotlight on in the country, because I think if you look sort of systemically across government, whether federally, provincially, municipally, we probably have more of the inefficient examples than we do have the streamlined and efficient examples. And whether it's the big ones making the news like Passport Canada, or the small everyday interactions we have with our city, our province, whatever, kudos to you for having been able to make such progress. And frankly, we should be parading these stories around the country and laying out the roadmap for how we do this more often, right? So
yeah, and I think, ministers have a responsibility, not just here in Ontario, but across the country, to really get things done, and their staff, and you do have to continually push and move the needle to get it done, but it can be done.
Yeah, I think my biggest frustration as a conservative in Canada is always, why bother pushing to get elected if once we get there, we run into this wall that is the public service, and this wall that is like an inability to actually push our ideas into reality. And there are obviously exceptions to that, but it just feels like the general sentiment is always stacked up against conservatives when you think about the incentives of the execution arms of our government, right? So I think these are great stories for us to be talking about.
Yeah, so Minister McNaughton, we've talked a lot about sort of the economic side of the work that you do, and the creation of opportunities, getting people involved in the skilled trades, for newcomers, giving them the chance to live up to their potential based on their training and their talents. But I'm wondering if we could also talk about the social side of some of this stuff, because I think a lot of what I see when it comes to conservative policymaking across the board, and this is true in the UK, in Australia, in the United States, as much as it is in Canada, is that conservatives can be very comfortable talking about economics, but when it comes to sharing our vision for culture or social policy, that's where I think we start to get a bit nervous and not as confident that we might have solutions for communities that are looking for, example, barriers to be removed for their participation, or parents who are worried that their children might not believe that they're going to get a fair shot because of what they look like or where they come from. And I know that's an important part of your work, in the sense that you are creating opportunities for people who are wrestling with the consequences of decades of liberal social policy as well. So maybe you could speak a bit to that side of your work, and whether you think as a conservative government, there's a unique challenge or also a unique opportunity on the social policy side.
Yeah, and Jamil, I just want to tell you, before Father's Day, you wrote an amazing column in the National Post about the importance of fathers. So I want to give you a shout out for that, because I thought that was really, really a tremendous column. So for all the viewers today, check Jamil's column out on that, because I think that really speaks to the importance of families and the family unit, because that's obviously fundamental, the most fundamental part of our society. Look, I see this as an opportunity. And when I talk about, spreading opportunity more widely and fairly in every region of the province to everyone, and creating a level playing field, like that's what we're doing. I think of, what we've done with Indigenous peoples. I mean, we've got no recognition on this, but we've trained thousands of Indigenous peoples for careers in the skilled trades, and it was removing barriers. I mean, one of the issues that 3 of the First Nations communities in Southwestern Ontario had was the transportation getting to and from training centers and to job sites. And we've done a lot of work on that. Again, that's upward mobility, strengthening families. Another great thing that we've done that probably conservatives haven't done in the past, but we partnered with an agency called the John Howard Society, where we trained 40 or 50 people, predominantly women. Almost all of them were on social assistance, who had a criminal background. So people that, maybe 20 years ago had a charge of theft, and every one of them now is working in manufacturing. We have a huge shortage in manufacturing, gain jobs with pensions and benefits. But that's great, like you say, Jamal, but it's, how does that impact the family? And I remember talking to Colleen in Hamilton one day. She had 3 children. I mean, she could not land a job in many, many years because she was get to the final interview and she'd have to declare that she had a criminal background years ago, and she could never get that pathway into a meaningful career. So it's all hands on deck to help people and to build stronger families and stronger communities. I don't know if I've answered your question, Jamil. You can push me.
Yeah, you have. I want to just follow up because you mentioned a couple of times some of the stories that you've seen on the ground, which we probably don't see reported on in the news. I'm wondering if you could maybe comment on how to get those stories told better. If there's anything you learned from your first mandate that you might apply now that you're on your second, about getting the human experience stories out there about how these policies are making a difference.
Yeah, that's one of our team's top priorities as we move into the second term. Using social media more effectively, getting a network of conservatives like the Canada Strong and Free network to really push those messages out, because these stories that I've referenced, I mean, all of these stories are reality because of what a conservative government has done. And I mean, I'm of the opinion that the left think government should do everything. There's some on the right that think government shouldn't do anything, but there is a role to play for government to lift people up, to improve upward mobility. I think it was Chris that mentioned, the banning of non-compete clauses. Like we were seeing in Ontario, people working in restaurants having to sign non-compete clauses. I mean, that was never the intent of them. And I mean, it's things like that I really do believe that government has a role in. And, I've not swung the pendulum, from left to right or right to left. Like we've really taken an approach that's all about, meaningful jobs and purpose-driven lives.
Thanks for that. I'm gonna try to change course a little bit and talk about a topic a little bit outside of your day-to-day portfolio. But I'm curious, you are among maybe a new wave of politicians that were elected quite young. And when I think about optimism, I think about, caring about what the future looks like, which often younger generations force us to think about the future in a way that we wouldn't otherwise think about. When you have kids, your mindset starts to change. When you have 40, 50 years in front of you, your mindset of the future changes. I mean, there's always sort of a trade-off between young enthusiasm, energy, and experience. And you came into office, I think you were in 34, 35 years old, something like that, when you were first elected as a member of provincial parliament. We now see this quite commonly across the conservative movement, a lot of younger people getting elected. I mean, I work in an industry in tech where the average age of my team and my company is under 30, and where big ideas and big things get done. But I'm curious, what those trade-offs are and how you perceive them. Like, what are the risks of bringing in energy without experience, and vice versa?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think it's like every team and every organization, you need people with different backgrounds. I think of our family business. I mean, it's funny. At least I think it's funny. As Minister of Labor, I can't say now at what age my dad had me, in the hardware store working, sweeping floors and cleaning washrooms and stocking shelves, because we have rules against that. But I think back to our family business. I mean, we have people from all walks of life, young, seniors. I remember, and we'd hire people to work in our electrical departments that were retirees for Hydro One here. So I think it's important to have a mix, people from all different backgrounds. And I give credit to Premier Ford. He really did recruit candidates from all walks of life. So people of color, people that ran large companies, like large employers, people with a sports background. I mean, the seat we won in Hamilton was a former CFL player who, toward the end of his career became a mentor to young people in sports in Hamilton. So there's, a mix that we need. I was young, but also came from, a private sector background. And, I had a dad that, really taught me what hard work was all about. And, there was no sleeping in, and I've tried to take that approach to politics.
Yeah, and I think, probably a trend that people are noticing, is definitely part of the rhetoric in the last provincial election a month ago is, voter turnout's coming down. And I think probably a portion of that, or a disproportionate portion of that, is probably young people not finding that they see solutions in government, that they don't find vision in their government. They don't get inspired by their politicians the way maybe we did in prior generations. So I do think there's a problem to solve there. I think it's encouraging to see people of different walks of life and different age groups deciding to take a chance on government. But that's also the challenge for us to solve, is to figure out how do we make sure that upcoming generation, like ours, frankly, looks at government as a solution for good and not just an inefficient reality of life that we all have to sort of bear through. So it's exciting to see people like you getting into the offices that you do.
Great, thanks. I know, there's certain issues that appeal obviously to a younger demographic. I think of the reforms we did for gig workers, right? The foundational set of rights for the first time in Canada, that engaged a different demographic, and the skilled trades as well. Starting in September, we're introducing the trades as early as grade 1 in every elementary school, sending recruiters into every high school, sending tradespeople in to engage young people. So there'll be a lot of engagement on that front as well.
I didn't mention this at the beginning, but my business works exclusively with gig workers, and your policy was definitely very well received by the industry, by workers. We work with tens of thousands of gig workers across North America, and I think you're setting a tone. We work in the U.S. as well, and I think there's already starting to be examples of people pointing to Ontario as precedent for what will likely follow in jurisdictions in the U.S. So big changes coming, an industry that probably policymakers weren't really talking about 5 years ago, but is a big reality in our daily lives now, right? So
yeah, and really a growing part of Ontario's economy and Canada's economy. The one issue as well that I didn't mention in our Working for Workers Act, which again was something that I think really aligns with conservative values, is the right to privacy. So we're now mandating that any employer with 25 or more employees has to tell workers when they're monitoring their electronic devices. So whether they're recording them, audio or video. In some businesses in Ontario, we found out during the pandemic that when employees were going to the washroom, they had to use their card to scan into the washroom, while employers were actually monitoring how long they were in the washroom for. So really working on rebalancing those scales and to put privacy front and center as well.
Yeah, so actually, Jamil, I have a question for you. How are we doing on time? Do we have time for some audience questions?
Yeah, I think we can probably squeeze at least one in. So if you want to pick one from the Q&A, feel free, Chris.
Sure. Yeah. So there's one that I really like. So when we talk about building and construction, again, this is like a productive, grow the pie, positive sum game way of thinking about both politics, but really life, right? As opposed to kind of like, frankly, discussions more along the lines of like equity and inclusion, where it's like, your slice is this big, mine's that big. Like I need some of that slice. Like, this is positive sum. Like, let's all win. Let's lift the tide, or whatever, rise the tide, lift all the boats. So there are a couple of questions around labor shortages. So when we think about growing the pie, it's really, in an economics language, it's like a supply side agenda. How do we do more of the things that we want to do? How do we get more of the things that we want? We have not enough capacity in our ICU. Let's build more hospitals. We don't have enough construction. Let's get more construction workers. We don't have enough nurses. Let's train more nurses, recognize foreign credentials, and so forth. So you touch a little bit upon kind of like the immigration side of this, which is really federal jurisdiction, but I think it's critical to your portfolio and to what we're doing in Ontario. There was a stat that was shared in the chat, and I saw this actually shared by Colliers, that something like 23% of general trade workers in the GTA are retiring over the next 5 years. We need a ton of housing. We're going to hear, I'm sure, more from the housing industry. We need a ton of housing, and the people who build housing are retiring and not getting replaced at the rate that they should be getting replaced. So you've talked about the reforms you've made to streamline a lot of that training, but ultimately we also might just need more bodies, right? So we want to train more Ontarians, but we also want to find people who have these skills around the world and let them in to kind of contribute again to our economy and our country. So can you tell us a little bit more about your like how you think about immigration and what the province can do in coordination with the feds and that sort of thing?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this was one of the big things that was added after the election to our ministry. So, I mean, specifically on the trades in Ontario today, 1 in 3 journey persons is over the age of 55. So there's a tsunami of retirements coming. And by 2025, 1 in 5 jobs in Ontario will be trades related. So it's really, just a real big challenge. I actually think the labor shortage is the greatest economic challenge that we have. I mean, I think back to March of 2020, 200,000 jobs are going unfilled. Today in Ontario, 378,000 jobs are going unfilled. So it is a huge challenge. I mean, I referenced this earlier on. 211,000 newcomers are going to come to Ontario this year. We have a say over 9,700 of them. So next week, I'll be meeting with the federal Liberal minister responsible for immigration and really, pushing for a new deal for Ontario. And I know other provinces are really in the same boat, but, we need to be focusing exclusively, at least from Ontario's perspective, on economic immigration. I mean, we know the federal government, focuses a lot on family reunification and refugees. And, obviously some of that's important, but we need more of a focus on a skilled immigration. The Scotiabank had a great report. I mean, it's costing Ontario's economy something like $20 billion in each of the next 5 years from labor shortages and not maximizing potential of newcomers that are already here. So again, from an economic perspective, it's critical that we get this resolved. And, from a quality of life perspective, right? We want people here making, bigger take-home pay to provide for themselves and their families and spend more in our communities.
Well, we want to thank you so much for joining us for this hour, Minister McNaughton. It's been a fantastic way of kicking off our Canadian Optimist series. And I hope that everyone who's been with us and listening learned something and maybe got a sense of what we as the conservative movement might want to expect from our elected officials when it comes to the future of labor policy in this country. As a reminder, for those who are with us and under the age of 30, or if you know someone under the age of 30, we are accepting applications for the Conservative Values Tomorrow mentorship program, And those applications are open until August 5th. So please do share the website, conservativetomorrow.ca. And for those who can join us in Red Deer, Alberta on September 24th, we look forward to welcoming you to our networking conference out west. It will be just 2 weeks after the federal leader is elected for the Conservative Party. So there'll be a lot of interesting conversations to be had. And we'll be making announcements in the coming weeks about who our guests will be, our keynote speakers, our panel discussions, all sorts of great content coming your way. We thank you very much for joining us. On behalf of Matt Spoke and Chris Spoke, we look forward to welcoming you to next month's edition of the Canadian Optimists. And we thank again our special guest, Monty McNaughton. Take care, everybody.